Today, I bring you a twist on my What If Everything Goes Perfect series. Its evil twin, What If Everything Goes Terrible. Now this is significantly harder than the perfect series. For the perfect one, just have nations make logical decisions based on hindsight, and have them get rich, big and powerful. The terrible series is way harder, because right off the bat, the US loses their war of independence and simply doesn't exist. There you go, video is done. Obviously, this would be rather boring. So instead, this video will be an experiment. I will offer multiple timelines and multiple points where things may have gone terribly wrong for the US. Our first scenario finds us in 1776, the start of the American Revolution. The militias are fighting bravely against the British armies led by their leader, Washington. But British forces land back on the continent and manage to wipe the floor with the Americans. In an unfortunate engagement, the great leader of the revolutionaries gets captured, destroying American morale. The British king then realizes pure military force will never fully defeat this revolt. So, the British offer compromise to the revolutionaries. With the military situation further deteriorating, the Spanish and the French don't put major resources in aiding the revolutionaries. So eventually, the revolution pretty much gets defeated. The Brits and the Americans reach an agreement, allowing for significantly more autonomy for the colonists. The United States simply never exists, which is sure to be pretty bad for the US. Our next scenario brings us to the War of 1812. A newly independent US starts a war with Britain again, hoping to seize Canada from them. But oh, does this fail in the most spectacular way. The American invasion force gets cut off and destroyed, followed up with Britain starting a devastating naval blockade of the Americans. Despite the British still busy fighting Napoleon, they also muster the forces to launch a devastating attack on New York, then capturing Washington and burning down the White House. American attempts to reclaim the territories are rebuffed. And to make it even worse, the British capture Louisiana, devastating American usage of the Mississippi River. The British have proven that they can still dominate the young state, even while dealing with one of the greatest generals of all time. Meanwhile, over in the north, Tecumseh is leading a native resistance to the US, supported by the British. Due to British backing, they too achieve major successes, and eventually, the Americans are simply forced to make peace. And the peace would be devastating. The natives of the Northwest gain independence. The Brits force a change in the main border, but most devastatingly, the Louisiana territory is returned to the Spanish, at least for now. The American experiment has been smashed down, and Britain is making it very difficult for them to expand further. Even if Spain loses Louisiana to a massive new Mexican state, the British will prevent American reconquest. But things escalate as the slavery dispute comes into play. As the US stews on their east coast, abolition is gaining traction across the world. The South absolutely dominates this alternate US, and they try to enshrine slavery into US law. Egged on by Britain, it's actually the North that secedes, in a much less bloody civil war, splitting the US in two. The US, now just the South, is ruled by aristocratic elites, building up a state that only benefits the white landowners, more and more out of touch with the realities of the world, falling behind the much more industrial North as well as Britain. Another way to achieve practically the same result is to not have the US surrender during the War of 1812. The Federalist Party in the North had already discussed declaring independence from the US, as the North was suffering the most from the blockade and the lack of trade with Britain. And should the government just absolutely refuse peace, despite all odds being against them, the Brits may just support the North getting independence, before, eventually, making peace with the US anyway. Again, we now have a South dominated by the aristocracy, while the North is in Britain's sphere of influence, and the rich West is in Mexico's control. Let's go back to the Revolutionary Wars. This time, they do manage to achieve victory over the British, but then the question arises, what's next? How do we structure our new states? The first attempt were the Articles of Confederation, which was pretty terrible. The US government got a number of tasks but they received very little means to actually achieve those tasks, unable to effectively raise funds, control their borders, or anything really. So, the Constitutional Convention was called, and the famous words, "We the people," began the modern constitution. But what if the Articles of Confederation, for some reason, had simply remained in place? A critical mass of states decided that they don't want a more powerful central government. With the Articles of Confederation as the blueprint for the US, at no point does the state officially break up. But many states do start to drift apart, as they are a union only in name, working together on subjects only when the state thinks it would benefit them. In this form, the US never has the centralized leadership to rise to rival Britain, as the smaller state economies grow more dependent on Britain economically, as the US lacks the unity to come together and use their local advantage to push against their rivals. The US remains a not insignificant, but only regional power at best. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with the 2 videos I release every single week, consider doing so. Thank you. All of the conclusions we have discussed so far are mostly plausible, and they have one thing in common. They happen in the early history of the US. The US went extremely quickly from East Coast nation to sea to shining sea nation. With all of this rich land, or even just all of this rich land, the US becomes practically unstoppable, especially if responsible democracy is established. The only real way to knock the US down from this position is to have Britain completely focus on bringing the US down. This is quite unlikely, as Britain has much more lucrative and easy target, making such an aggressive stance towards the US a waste of resources. So, after this point, the US can absolutely still get weaker, but finding a truly terrible timeline is difficult. So, these next ones will be far more unrealistic than the ones that came before. The first one brings us all the way to the 1940s. The Germans absolutely rampaged around Europe, while the Japanese are rampaging around China. But most worryingly, the British have already signed a peace treaty with Germany, leaving Europe to the Germans completely. The Soviets then are not led by the iron dictator Stalin, who despite all of his terrible flaws, did greatly build up Soviet industrial potential. Instead, Bukharin leads the Soviet Union. Soviet economic growth is a lot more healthy and a lot more agricultural, which may benefit Russia long term. But it is terrible at this moment. Without Germany at war with Britain, Lend-Lease never gets started either, as the American public cares not for supporting the communists. The Soviets, without a significant industrial base, get completely wiped out by the Germans, while the Japanese take advantage and seize the Soviet East. The Japanese are also significantly more successful in China, capturing Chongqing and basically destroying the organized Chinese forces. Obviously, all sorts of resistance movements will still remain active, but the organized resistance is gone. So Europe is ruled by Germany, and the most populous state on Earth is ruled by the Japanese. The only remaining US ally is Britain, which is an island extremely vulnerable to the Germans, while Britain's worldwide empire, especially due to Japanese and German backing, see their empire unravel and weaken. So, despite us not changing anything about the US, the Americans are now one of 3 continent-spanning superpowers. The US, and indeed the whole world, is headed into a much more horrific future than our timeline. For the next timeline, we are headed back in time again, and we will change a single thing. George Washington, by all accounts, was so popular by the end of the American Revolution, he could have pretty much steered the nation in whatever direction he wanted. Luckily, he was humble, reluctant to take up power, and began a troubled but mostly successful democracy. But what if George Washington was a Napoleon? How do I mean this? Washington goes along with some aspects of liberalism, but in practice becomes either dictator or king over the new state, to complete America's ideological decline. Rather than a clear state and church split, religion becomes an integral part of the American state. Like Napoleon did, certain rights and liberties would still be expanded, It wouldn't be a full absolutist monarchy, but the democratic experiment failed before it really got started. America may still rise to a powerful position in North America, even under their monarchy, but internally, the US is just like the European states of old, ruled by a single person with a powerful aristocracy holding power. In a worst-case scenario, they could end up like another Brazil. For the international power of the US, this is by no means the worst outcome out of the bunch, but especially for the people within the US, this is quite a downgrade from our timeline. Then we travel back to 1945, where we will discuss just the first decade of what an American defeat in the Cold War scenario may look like, just to illustrate how much we would have to change to even have a chance of making this happen. First off, we have to change the Soviets, especially in the post-Stalin years. Giving the Soviets a more functional but still socialist system would be fundamental for the Soviets to not collapse. But then, the real fun starts. Following the Allied victory in Asia, the Communists take control over all of China, managing to rush Taiwan before the West could respond. In Japan, the Emperor is trialed and killed by the Americans as a war criminal, radicalizing Japan and creating anti-American guerrillas. During this chaos, the newly established North Korea invades the newly established South Korea, overrunning and reunifying the peninsula. Due to the Communist Chinese full defeat of the nationalists, they take up the UN seat, meaning America doesn't get a UN coalition to help back the South. Over to Europe, we have the Soviets betray and occupy large portions of Yugoslavia, bringing them closer to the Soviet sphere. In Greece, a communist revolution is able to bring down the central government with Soviet help, practically securing all of Eastern Europe for the Soviets. But it gets better. The American Marshall Plan is rejected. America will not help Europe's recovery from this war. Not only does this make America weaker, it also makes Europe more sympathetic to the communists. In Italy, a socialist government is formed after the first election, same with France. These regimes are not puppets to Moscow, but they do form a neutral third bloc. In Germany, the lack of Marshall aid sees them not integrate into the Western world as willingly, while European integration projects wouldn't get on the way at all. Europe as a whole becomes way poorer than in our timeline. By this point, has the US already lost the Cold War? Absolutely not. But it is just a taste of the huge amount of dominoes I would need to knock over to even come close to having this happen. And that was our final scenario for today. For anyone wondering why I didn't include a scenario where the South becomes independent during the Civil War, it's simple. The surviving United States is still a behemoth, likely to become the most powerful state on Earth anyway. While the South is a backwards and likely weak state, pretty much certain to be reconquered somewhere down the line. This scenario may even lead to a more successful reconstruction, benefiting the US in the long term, depending on how long the South was independent for. It may be a setback for the US, but unless we change far more of history, it doesn't qualify as a terrible scenario. So that's it for this video. Let me know if you enjoyed this concept, which scenarios you may like to see explored in full, and which other nations you might like to see next in the Terrible series.